It was 1 year ago today. Vladimir Putin shocking the world with his bid to take Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine. Turns out it would be the first of many surprises. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of The World This Week. I'm François Picard. With us, Craig Kapitis, contributing editor for The Daily Beast. How are you?
Good, François.
Want to welcome as well Mariana Perabeniziuk, contributor to Ukraine Weekly, Ukrainian journalist based in Paris. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
With as well our former Moscow correspondent, Elena Voloshin, host in French of France 24's Scene from Russia segment. How are you?
I'm fine.
Busy day?
Busy day, busy year.
Busy year. And from Kyiv, pleasure to welcome back Alexandre Kerry, reporter for the Kyiv Independent, co-author in French of Diary of the Ukrainian Resistance. How are you on this February 24th?
Good, busy day too, and busy year indeed, yes.
You can, by the way, listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other fine streaming services. February the 24th, 2022, after the troop buildup, the failed mediation, Vladimir Putin's speech denouncing Ukraine as a fiction, Russian special forces swoop for the capital's main military airport in a bid to establish an air bridge to seize Kyiv. But Ukraine resists and bombs the runway. And when the U.S. offers to evacuate President Zelensky, his ambassador to London says he replied, quote, "I need ammunition, not a ride."
Всім добрий вечір.
Good evening, everyone. Fraction leaders here. The head of the presidential office is here. Prime Minister's here. Podolyak is here. The president is here. Our troops are here. Citizens are here. All of us are here, protecting our independence of our country.
Alexander Kerry, when Volodymyr Zelensky was streaming live on Facebook, were you there?
Yes, I was there because, as we all remember, he streamed this video, if I'm not wrong, on the 25th or 25th or the 26th, and yes, I was in Kiev at this moment. It was also many watershed moments for us, and let's say for Ukrainians, or for everyone who stayed here, because it showed that this nation would break. It showed that Zelensky was actually up to the task. A lot of people who were, as I do remember, skeptic about his ability to be up to the task. And actually, this night, he sort of revealed himself, the wartime leader that he is today. So yes, it was a crucial moment for a lot of Ukrainians. He gave.
What was your personal thought during those first 24 hours? How were you feeling in Kyiv?
It was, I want to say it was fairly chaotic, because you have to take into account that I had a little bit of experience on the front line since in Kiev since 12. But there's a difference between going to the front line and getting used to these explosion sounds and them erupting into the capital, into your daily life. So it was extremely chaotic because even though I had some plans, any kind of plan, even the most prepared ones, are not working in such moments. You know, there's always a moment when you think it won't happen, and when it happens, sort of collapses. So it was intense indeed. I mean, I spent most of the day in bomb shelters, and then I decided to stay in my flat to continue working because it was hard to work in a bomb shelter at the time. Since then, infrastructure changed a bit. But
It has indeed changed. I want to stick with that first day of the war. Elena Voloshin here present. Was on the Russian side. You were reporting for France 24 on a highway from Belgorod to the Ukrainian border and Kharkiv. Tell us what you saw.
Yeah, so I went a few days before the full-scale invasion to the border because to see and to show this massive concentration of troops at the border, and also they made up mise en scène with all these refugees coming from Donetsk and Luhansk, because they staged, the Russian propaganda staged an alleged attack from Ukraine.
And here we
on
see
the Donbass region.
this tank sort of skidding on a highway.
Yes, and meanwhile, so I saw those tanks that was going to Ukraine to attack Ukraine. That was completely terrifying, because we saw also for the first time we saw this Z on the tanks, which just meant like nothing. And since then, Putin never explained what does it mean. It was like really a terrorist operation, a mafia operation from Russia. I'm covering this war since 2014, the war in the Donbass region, and I insist on the fact always that the war didn't start now. It's not 1 year of a war, it's 9 years of a war. But of course, no one would expect that this horror, this full-scale tragedy would happen. I understood that it would on the 22 February, when I heard Vladimir Putin holding this terrifying speech when for once he was honest on his intentions and was just negationist about the existence itself of the Ukrainian state. But of course, at 5 a.m. in the morning, when I was 15 kilometers from the border in the Belgorod region, when I heard the helicopters and my phone rang and France 24 said he launched the attack, it was like just complete horror.
A year on, we're still wondering why, Craig Topidas, why did he invade?
I have no idea. We'd have to ask him. Look, we really don't know the answer. It's a hypothetical question.
Isn't that incredible that 1 year later we don't know why?
It doesn't surprise me. Putin lives in this mythical universe of spirits and hobgoblins and Russian Orthodox priests, and the only way we're ever going to find out is if we get him in front of a tribunal, a war crimes tribunal, and that's never going to happen because Russia would have to give him up, which they would never do, or we'd have to go to Moscow and take him out and bring him to The Hague. So I don't think we're ever going to know.
Mariana Perebeznyuk,
Oh, yeah.
have you made sense of what happened 1 year ago?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a difficult question because, of course, it's difficult to comprehend why someone would make such a massive action that would engage the whole Russia and that would ultimately bring Russia into ruin afterwards. So it doesn't seem logical, but in fact it is, because since 2014 it has always been doubling down. And finally, Ukrainian resilience didn't start a year ago. Ukrainian resilience started in March 2014. That was the first, the most significant bet.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call. They realize they have to reform the way the military's run, the way the police is run.
Well, look, when you remember March, April 2014, that's in a way as terrifying as March 2022, because at that time Ukrainians felt they had no military at all, no arms at all, nothing. Even trucks, military trucks wouldn't work because suddenly, there were no engines were not working. And it was like that all the time. The country was attacked. The country had been being occupied, and there was nothing to resist it. And still Ukrainians decided to resist, having nothing. And Ukrainians have gradually built this capacity to resist, and resisted so well that Vladimir Putin had no choice but just to continue doubling down to bring down Ukraine.
That was not our problem at the time. Yes, this conflict started in 2014, but our job, if you weren't at the front line, was how do you get an audience interested in this? How do I get my readers interested in this, which they weren't? And it was quite interesting. One of the first things that I did and I noticed was actually happening, the best way to reach people, particularly Americans whose weaponry you needed, was to go to the movies. And there was an old film called Taurus Bulba with Tony Curtis and Yul Brynner. And laugh if you will, but this sparked people in the movement in the United States, because there is a scene when they're coming out of the steps And Yul Brynner is screaming, Zaporozhye, Zaporozhye, and all of the Cossacks come down. It's one of the most famous scenes in cinema, come out of the hills.
Elena
And believe it or not, but Yul Brynner is believed to be of Russian descent, but if I'm not mistaken, he is somewhat of Ukrainian descent, actually.
Vladivostok, actually, with Ukrainian blood. But
Elena
that got
Volic,
people
in
interested.
2014, did you find it difficult to get the world's attention when you were reporting?
In fact, no, because it was the first war in Europe since maybe the Second World War. But the attention was limited in time because at some point it was not interesting anymore for Europeans. What I would like to stress is that to me it makes pretty clear why did Vladimir Putin try to invade all Ukraine. When you listen to him, when you listen to his propaganda, it's it makes completely sense.
Which is your job, by the way.
Yes, of course. He's an imperialist. He has lots of references to Peter the Great. He has drawn new maps for geography lesson in schools. It's like official maps now just shows Russia with Ukraine, with Belarus. He thinks that the borders of Russia are the borders of the empire. That's the first thing. That's a geopolitical vision. But he also he's just a religious fanatic. Now I'm reading Ivan Ilyin, who is the Russian philosopher who inspired Putin, and he was a total religious fanatic. And his all the aim of his philosophy is to say that the good, which is the violence, must fight the evil, which is the weakness, and eradicate and fight for the right values, for the values of religion, for against homosexuality, for traditional values. And when you read Ilyin, it's just like exactly what Putin is standing in his propaganda,
Yeah,
that he must eradicate.
Let's talk about this ideological aspect, because it's something that has dominated the news cycle this very week. It's a battle of ideas and of faiths. Dateline Moscow, the date is January the 19th. Here you see the head of the Russian Orthodox Church warning of threats to the whole human race. Patriarch Kirill, who warns that any desire to destroy Russia, quote, will mean the end of the world, Craig Kapitas.
Yeah, what a barrel of superstitious hooey and voodoo. But Putin, as you said, believes in this. And as I see it, that was the most important. Everyone has their own angle, what they think is the most important part of the story. This is what I think is the most important part, was that his decision-making process is not above the creed of superstition and mythical creatures. We wrote about this to great extent. And by the way, the analysts, the CIA guys who are sitting there trying to answer this question, which we'll never have answered until we get them in a courtroom, actually, they take this very, very seriously. This is what empowers him. In fact, very briefly, 3 days ago, I had a contact with an adult Russian, very well connected, smart fellow. He tells me that Putin, on a daily basis, he's connected, is meeting with 2 astrologers. And I'm going, what? And he says, yes, yes, yes. Now, whether it's true or not doesn't matter. This individual believes that it's true, and a lot of Russians believe it's true, and that's where Putin's power lies.
Alexander Kerry, you and I have been to school. We're taught, we're taught that the course of history is shaped by pragmatic needs, by the fact that you have economic forces battling each other. Do you really think that it's this kind of messianic ideology?
Well, I mean, superstition aside, we have to take into account the power of the Russian and, in general, the Orthodox Church when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. There are events that are unfortunately often forgotten because it's a little bit complex when it comes to the liturgy. But we shouldn't forget that a few years ago, the Ukrainian Church, Orthodox Church, became independent from the Russian. It means a lot of followers falling into the Ukrainian side. It means that also the Russian Orthodox market, so to speak, is losing a lot of followers and losing a lot of market and losing a lot of influence, which also explains why there was a recent crackdown on the Russian affiliated Orthodox Church, because it is seen and it's been proven now, because we saw a lot of Russian propaganda there, that it has become a fifth column. It also has been proven that Kirill was a KGB asset in Switzerland. His name was Mikhailo something. I think that was his name. It's KGB name. So my point is that it's not only about superstition and Messianic here. I don't think we should overestimate Putin's, let's say, faith or good faith about faith, but the very fact that the Russian Orthodox Church has indeed become, for a while, let's say, the religious arm and political arm of Putin.
And Mariana Parabenesiuk,
Yes.
we have this split between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian one that happened after 2014.
Well, actually, that split happened way before, but I would just like, because you have spoken about a very good point about like the true reasons which are pragmatic, but these reasons, everybody have seen them during this year. For example, with the massive looting of Ukrainian elementary resources and with the maritime blockades of Ukraine, suddenly the whole world found out that the elementary security of the world depends on Ukraine, on the agricultural production of Ukraine, and Ukrainian resources are not stopping here. In fact, the most important resource for Russia, without which Russia is not viable as empire, and I liked very much Yelena's position about it, because the true religion of Putin is imperialism. His religion is to make this empire live, and this empire cannot live without Ukrainian resources, which are at once agricultural, natural resources, but moreover, these are human resources. Ukraine, for instance, Russia has nuclear arms. Ukraine doesn't have anymore. But most of that arms were developed in Ukraine, and most of that arms were maintained by Ukrainian specialists up to 2014, for example, with the exception of the launchers from submarines, I believe. All the other Russian nuclear bombs were maintained by the Ukrainian specialists. Ukraine does have so much to offer in terms of human resources that Russia doesn't have, that this empire has never been viable before Ukraine. The empire itself started with the incorporation of Ukraine, and when Ukraine goes away, it is the beginning of the end of the empire, and that is the ultimate reason of this war.
And let's not forget that they are displacing populations as much as they can. They are displacing Ukrainian populations. They are trying to re-educate children and adults ideologically to this parallel reality that they are liberating Ukraine.
All of that's
exactly, and he made it very clear and very simple on the 22nd February 2022, Vladimir Putin, when he said Ukraine does not exist as a state, as a nation, and Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. He even made it clear 1 year before when he already wrote a big text about it. So I mean, it's completely clear that he does consider that Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the former empire, must be just one and single country under the rule of Moscow.
In those opening days of the war, when Russian forces seize Chernobyl, they seize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear complex, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. What was going through your mind, Mariana?
Well, first of all, I won't lie. Personally, I thought that somewhat it won't. If you speak about the Chernobyl, the exclusion zone, I have worked in the exclusion zone, and like from what I knew is that it will harm, first of all, the Russian soldiers that are in. There is nothing to. There is no real danger if you don't like make huge mistakes. There is no real dangers, but this was not a mistake. Actually, that was part of the plan, because Ukrainians and Belarusians are among the victims of the Chernobyl catastrophe. You know, when this catastrophe happened, I was a child, and my parents, my mom, managed to leave Kiev. And by the way, in the Soviet Union, it was not easy to leave a town. First of all, you had the obligation to live where you had your domicile in, and second of all, you had to work, and you couldn't just take a leave. and not to go to work. That was like a criminal crime in the Soviet Union. But all people, they were afraid and they tried to leave. And my mom, I remember she left our home for 2 months, and hundreds of thousands of inhabitants of Kiev precisely, and probably millions of Ukrainians and Belarusians did live it as a huge, absolutely huge traumatism. And Vladimir Putin and those who prepared the operation, they of course knew that traumatism, and they made it just to reactivate it and to seed the panic.
I totally agree with Marianne on the fact that it was part of the plan. I remember, because I'm studying Russian propaganda since 2014 during the revolution of Maidan, and I remember a TV set on Russian TV where Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, was saying Ukraine has all these nuclear plants, and with this Nazi that took grip on the power in Kiev with the revolution in Maidan, Russia must intervene. It must take under control these nuclear plants, otherwise there is a danger of a great nuclear catastrophe, saying that Ukrainian would blow up their own nuclear plants. So this is part of the and all this was a call and the preparation of Russian public opinion to what would happen 8 years later. So I mean, it was definitely part of a plan. The full-scale invasion was definitely planned. I don't know when, because we heard this propaganda even in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. Exactly. About the Ukrainian nationalists, Nazis, and the West that was supporting Nazis in Ukraine. So it's not new. But when did he decide that it would happen one day? I don't know. But definitely in 2014, all this was already in his mind, was already in his maybe dreams and plans.
By the way, in 2014, there have been military maneuvers all over Ukraine too. We don't know why it went this way, that the first invasion was more limited than the second one, but everything was in place to prepare it too, and so that it would happen the way it happened in 2022.
Certainly, Alexander, Kerry, testing the waters, what with first the seizing of Crimea in 2014, and then obviously going further 1 year ago today. There's been a statement on that point from G7 nations that have been conferring, saying they'll never recognize, this is a statement come out in the past couple of hours, they'll never recognize the illegal annexation of eastern Ukraine regions by Russia, nor of Crimea and Sebastopol. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's the very least. Also, I think it's also interesting because when you say testing water, it's interesting how in 2014 this strategy of trying to put Russian assets work in Donetsk and Luhansk, it didn't work in Odessa and Kharkiv, and we know for a fact that there were Russian elements in Odessa and Kharkiv who were trying to do the same than they did in Donetsk and Luhansk. At the end of the day, there's a question of reality also, and there's a question of poor planning. The question of reality is that, well, Putin can claim he annexed regions, but I mean, as a result, he doesn't control anything in Kherson. He doesn't control anything in Zaporizhia. He doesn't have the oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk. So I think the point is the reality just, slams back at him. And there is also the poor planning. I think that's also an important point because you raised the topic of Chernobyl. A lot of investigation showed that Russian soldiers who came to Chernobyl actually had maps from the 80s that weren't showing the zone of exclusion. And the whole investigation shows that, well, they were acting on maps that are not upgraded, that are not, let's say, accurate anymore, which also explained that some also civilian buildings, except those who were targeted, some civilian buildings were also the victims of some Russian strikes. My other point is there's only so much you can do. There's only so much you can claim when it comes to annexation. You can claim you can annex, Kherson or Zaporizhia, but if you don't control Kherson or Zaporizhia, you don't control anything. So then you can't annex anything.
Right, and I want to get back in a moment to this point about what is actually controlled 1 year on to after this full-scale invasion. But just one final point. Craig Kapitas was mentioning earlier about the war crimes, the atrocities. Russian forces retreating on March the 31st from points north of Kyiv. They left in a hurry. The following day, when Ukrainian forces move into the suburb of Bucha, the world discovers with shock this graphic evidence, Elena Voloshin, of those war crimes. And it was, we'd heard reports, but to actually see it this blatantly was a shock.
That's beyond words. What could I say? I mean, Bucha is just a humanity tragedy. I don't know. There, as Craig said, there must be a trial for that. I have nothing to say. Like dozens of dead bodies and just evidence of, not only war crimes. These people are not died from shelling. They have been shot in the head. They have been tortured. They have been. They have their hands tied. I mean, this is just barbaric.
What you saw in Bucha and elsewhere is certainly hideous cruelty, no question. The war crimes are alleged. They are not proven. Any lawyer will tell you that. They'll tell you that at The Hague as well. It's very discomforting to have to say that, but it's true, because Putin has created laws, like Hitler did, that allow this. And unfortunately, evil, as we might define it, is not indictable in a court of law. So we can sit here, and I understand the reason to keep calling these things war crimes. However, the bigger question is, how do we get Putin and his cronies to The Hague? And remembering, even if you kill Putin, a dead wasp can still sting.
I have the answer.
Tell us.
Well, first of all, we are not obliged to take Putin to The Hague. Because to take Putin, we need like a special tribunal, not the international criminal court, who cannot judge Putin, and I think that will be done. Speaking of what happened in Bucha and Ukrainian suburbs, what we discovered in the suburbs of the Ukrainian capital, but what happened all over other places, including starting from 2014 in Donbass. That's also what happened
in Chechnya.
And that's what I want. That's where I wanted to say. Because there is one very important thing to say. These are, first of all, war crimes. This is like a legal qualification. There is no doubt about it. Second of all, that's what Russian army does for 30 years. And we had evidence of it, but we never had this, unfortunately, fresh, dead, tortured bodies, this like freshness and this no distance between us and the crime. And the important thing to know...
unequivocal evidence like this.
The important thing to know is that the only reason we could finally... The world could finally see it, while these are the atrocities that happened like in Grozny in like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is because the Ukrainian nation was able to resist and to liberate, to push the Russian invaders out, and that is the only reason we could discover it. And that should be a lesson for everyone, because if we want to combat these war crimes, we should be able to push back the war criminals.
Ukrainians pushing
it, but that's not going to happen.
Why?
Because the way the law works in this instance, and there's a lot of history on it.
In which instance?
First of all, the War Crimes Tribunal or any tribunal on this nature cannot try a defendant in absentia. It's not allowed. It's illegal. They have to physically
Special tribunal can.
Well, they can't. They can't. You have to be at the War Crimes Tribunal. You cannot be tried in absentia. You could look it up. I've reported on this. Put the patriotism aside and let... No,
it happened to Yugoslavia.
He was brought. They were brought.
No, there were some that were still in Serbia.
They were physically brought to the Hague, given up by the state. Same thing with the African leaders who were sent.
But it was a special tribunal, right?
Either way,
it was possible for the special tribunal.
The point Mariana is making about the fact that the Russians were pushed back, also a reminder that though how much the battle lines have moved in the space of 12 months. It's an artillery war in the heart of Europe. The current battle for Bakhmut likened to those 2 years of trench warfare slaughter between the French and the Germans at Verdun during World War I. With us is Oliver Farry, Oliver, you heard Alexander Kerry ask for maps. To show us what the map looked like 12 months ago.
Well, Moscow started its invasion of Ukraine in the small hours of February 24th, 2022, with troop movements from the north, from Belarus, and from the east through Sumy and Kharkiv, and from the south from Crimea, which had been annexed by Russia since 2014, but it didn't go to plan. The Russians met with fierce Ukrainian resistance and soon withdrew to concentrate their troops along the southern and eastern fronts, which is close to the territories that Russia and its proxies had been holding for the previous 8 years. There was little movement throughout the summer, but Ukrainian counteroffensive in the autumn bore fruit, winning back Izium and Balaklia in the east and Kherson in the south. Ukraine said it found mass graves and torture chambers in the liberated regions. Since November, it has been mainly a stalemate, with only Russia having a gain to speak of, with the town of Soledar taken in Donbass in mid-January. This is close to Bakhmut, which Moscow views as quite a big prize, though its significance is symbolic rather than strategic. As things stand, with neither side intending to give, it looks like the war in Ukraine will continue for some time.
And Oliver, 12 months has meant thousands of killed.
Yeah, though estimates vary, the Ukraine war has probably seen the greatest number of casualties in a European war since the Second World War. The Ukrainian government says up to 16,500 civilians have been killed. The European Commission puts that at 20,000. Ukrainian forces have suffered up to 13,000 dead and wounded, according to Kyiv, and up to 120,000 in an estimate by the Daily Telegraph. But it is Russia, despite being the aggressor, which is suffering the greatest losses, with both the US and UK defence departments estimating up to 200,000 dead or wounded, as many as 60,000 of those fatalities. It's said that Russian troops are vulnerable, being poorly equipped and trained, with poor supply chains, and have suffered greatly at the hands of artillery. And then there's the damage. The war has wrought destruction on many cities in Ukraine, with 45% of buildings in the port city of Mariupol destroyed, and 1/3 in the cities of Severodonetsk and Liman in the east.
Yeah, Russian. So many thanks for that, Oliver Farry. It's quite chilling, Elena Voloshin, and we saw with the mercenaries of Wagner used as cannon fodder. There again, this comparison with World War I.
Yeah, exactly. And about the Russian losses today in Scene from Russia, my show on Russian propaganda, I was showing an interview that I filmed with a Russian mercenary, a Russian chief mercenary, who was the first prime minister of this so-called Donetsk People's Republic, a Russian, actually, Alexander Borodai, who was predicting the full-scale war, but saying that even because he was making the scenario on the opposite, parallel reality on the Russian style, and he was saying even these idiots of Ukrainians are not going to attack now because of the Rasputitsa. And of course, he was talking about Russia, but as he's spreading the Russian official narrative, he said the Ukrainians are not going to attack now. There is the Rasputitsa, and we saw the catastrophe that was this one-man decision to attack Ukraine. All these losses, and since then there's just a tunnel of losses for Russia. And I don't know how about the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that Russia is bearing a huge toll in this invasion.
And we saw Robert Parsons reporting for France 24 earlier on with that tank unit. And for now, they're having to contend in this artillery war with a lot of Soviet-made equipment, sometimes 40 years old. In Kyiv this Friday, a visit by the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, announcing a first batch of 4 German Leopard tanks were already in Ukraine, Alexander Kerry.
Yes, it's indeed an important news for Ukraine. But what is true also is that Ukraine will have to wait for all the Leopards to come, for the Abrams, for all the, let's say, armored vehicle to come. Because Ukraine's strategy has been clear since the very beginning. There's this idea of having a so-called armored fist of tanks, and what Zaluzhny aims to do is creating this extremely strong, let's say, ensemble of battalions of tanks to strike at Russia and Russians as hard as they can when they can do it properly. Because again, the amount of tanks that were promised and the amount of tanks that Ukraine will receive might not be the exact same, which is a shame. But Ukraine will have to make with what they have at this moment.
Yeah, and a lot of leaders, by the way, have been to Kyiv this week. The prime ministers of Italy, Spain, and the first president of the United States to visit a war zone where Washington does not control the skies since Abraham Lincoln. We're talking about Joe Biden, famed for commuting by rail to his home in Delaware when he was a senator in Washington. This time he took the night train from the Polish border to Kyiv. There, Biden and his Ukrainian counterpart shrugging off an air raid during a walkabout that was held under tight security. We were waiting for some kind of a dramatic moment in the build-up to this week. Biden's visit to a war zone, Craig Kapitas.
Remarkable. As you said, first American president to visit a war zone since Abraham Lincoln. Gutsy. The guy's got cojones of steel, because anyone who believes that the Russians, given half a chance, wouldn't have blown that train or Biden up.
The U.S. says they forewarned, that they gave warning.
Yeah, right. The checks in the mail. Anyone who believes that given half a chance that the Russians would not have taken him out is whistling past the graveyard and doesn't know a damn thing about how the Russians operate.
Elena Voloshin?
Actually, I had more of a question when I saw Zelensky going to places like Kherson or Mykolaiv or this kind of situation, because I was thinking, and I'm even thinking, but why they are not striking the presidential palace in Kiev, for example? But I mean, I don't think they would strike on Biden, because the Russians know that at the second they just even think of launching a missile on Kyiv when Biden is there, it's going to be just the distraction.
We had this
of Russia.
Very surreal Russian talk shows read this on this visit because, you know, Russian propagandists, they got so much used into this rhetoric of striking everybody, destroying the whole world, so that the anchor herself was, but why didn't we kill Biden? And even Russian propagandist experts
Alexander
had
Kerry.
to cool it down. We still cannot kill Biden. But why?
Alexander Kerry, were Ukrainians where you are surprised that there was no big launch of missiles and drones on the anniversary date?
First, the week is not done yet. So, you know, we're expecting the weekend, and the night may be longer than we think. So, you know, we're still the week is not over yet. But we are actually also sort of expecting something, if not this week, the next week, because it's been a while. I mean, relatively speaking, it's been a while that we haven't had a mass missile strike in Kiev. So it might happen, it might not happen, but well, I mean, we live in that kind of reality for a year now. I think there's just one thing which is interesting when it comes to the Biden visit. It's interesting that the air alert actually rang out. The air alert rang out because some plane basically took off from Belarus, and out of safety, the air alert did ring out in Kiev. So it was not necessarily a missile, but what we know about is that it was indeed some bombardier plane taking off from Belarus. So my point is that these operations didn't stop just because Biden was in Kiev. That's, I think, an important thing to not to forget, is that those operations, the war continues despite those diplomatic visits.
Continues despite. And this was the French newspaper Le Monde on the visit. The headline, Joe Biden in Kyiv, democracy, I guess it translates as democracy is holding
on. Yeah.
The next day in Moscow, his Russian counterpart answered. Vladimir Putin telling both houses of parliament how it's Russia that's under attack from NATO and the West.
Responsibility for fomenting the Ukrainian conflicts, for its escalation, and for the increasing number of victims lies entirely with Western elites. And, of course, the current regime in Kyiv, for which the Ukrainian people are essentially strangers.
And this harks back to what we were discussing earlier. I'll put it to you, Mariana. This is not just the president of Russia. There are a lot of people in Russia who have an us versus them mentality.
Well, look, that reminds me of a Russian joke, of a Ukrainian joke. Well, don't be surprised. I wrote several articles about Ukrainian sense of humor, and it's linked to the war. So that reminds me of a Ukrainian war joke. So one Ukrainian is called, who has left the country, calls the other Ukrainian who is still there. He says, "So how is it going? You won't believe it. NATO is waging the war in Ukraine to Russia." Oh, Jesus Christ. And so how is it going? Are there many losses? Oh, yes, thousands of tanks for Russia, tens of thousands of soldiers lost for Russia and all of that. It's very big. Oh, Jesus. And NATO, do they have any losses? You won't believe it. NATO hasn't yet arrived yet.
There is.
That's the position of Ukraine, but of course that's what that's what Russia. It's not only Vladimir Putin. I totally agree with you, and Yelena can confirm that the whole Russian propagandist machine is on it. It's this mentality. We are under attack, and of course with this very specific method of mirroring the reality, because the truth is that it's the West who is under hybrid attacks of Russia for a decade, more so with very aggressive actually deeds, with hacking campaigns, that would leave European capitals without electricity for a couple of hours. We did have it. We did have French hospitals without electricity due to Russian hacking attacks in previous years. The subversion of democracy, of elections in the free world, the bribery of our political sphere. It is Russia who is at war with the West. In fact,
different worlds, different realities. Elena Voloshin, there was this Wednesday follow-up to that speech. The president making an appearance at the Defenders of the Fatherland Day concert at Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium, the same one where France won the World Cup.
Yeah, that was the fourth of a kind meeting at the Luzhniki Stadium from Vladimir Putin. The first one was 2012 for his presidential victory on the re-election. The second one, 2018, another re-election. And the third one for a world without Nazism. It was just right after the attack of Ukraine. I was at the first two ones. I infiltrated groups of actors who were paid 500 rubles with my camera just to get to attend this meeting. So you have to understand that you have to watch this meeting with the sound, because beyond the image of the waving flags and this so alleged massive support that stages Russian propaganda.
So nobody sitting around you believed in any of it. They were just
I think a small minority. Otherwise, it's just people who are paid for that, or students, school workers, and the years going, and the more and more this proportion of forced people and willing people to attend. And actually, the most of the people, they just don't know that Putin is going to come, because it's announced like a concert, and actually it's a big concert and a celebration, and Putin just appears. And I have a colleague who was there this year in the public, and he said, but when my neighbor learned that Putin is going to come, he left. So I mean,
but still, opinion polls suggest Vladimir Putin is still popular. And
I interviewed a couple of people yesterday and today who were at the Putin Palooza concert in Moscow, and they went for the free food. Shida kasha, pisha nasha. That's what was going on. They were handing out free bowls of cabbage soup, oatmeal, sausages. This is what I was told why people went. As far as the Biden thing, war is about symbolism. And your joke, I got one. You know why Putin didn't go to Kyiv? He didn't want to have to mess with the Klitschko brothers. Former heavyweight champion of the world.
Very wise of him.
And, yeah, very wise of him. And despite the symbols,
but that is essential to the optics.
No, of course it is.
Vladimir Putin has not been to the war zone, whereas Joe Biden
and why?
has.
But
except
the point
maybe the Kerch Strait Bridge.
Is the real story, beyond the maps, is the resilience of the Ukrainian people. I think this is what Putin is ultimately afraid of.
Hours after Putin spoke came the rebuttal. Joe Biden, who spoke to an audience which I was not paid to attend, directly telling the Russian people in front of Warsaw's historic royal castle that no way does NATO want to invade Russia. Quote, "This war was never a necessity, it's a tragedy."
One year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power. He doubts our continued support for Ukraine. He doubts whether NATO can remain unified. But there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver.
Well, let's ask the French guy on this panel. Alexander Kerry, are you surprised by Joe Biden?
No, not really. Actually, he's been fairly consistent since the very beginning. He can manage to sort of navigate between the bipartisanship when it comes to Ukraine. And also, I'm not surprised for a simple reason is that since the very beginning and since 2014, he was actually also the one to push for a stronger answer to Putin, and he's been a really strong supporter of a free, independent, and democratic Ukraine for a while now. Of course, we can talk about all the Biden scandal and Hunter Biden scandal and things like that, which is more or less fueling Russia's conspiracy theories. But when it comes to the support for Ukraine, it was not that much of a surprise that Biden is still standing shoulder to shoulder with Zelensky at the moment.
It's been a great week for the U.S. president. It's also been a great week for Craig Kapitas, his Polish hosts, who were hailed, and the U.S. president was gushing. They've been at odds with the European Union over rule of law issues. Now there is this unity over the war over Vladimir Putin's invasion.
If anyone knows what the Russians are capable of, it's the Poles. And I think that message has finally come home to the American leadership and a lot of other leaders in Europe. You know, we here in France, we're members of NATO, but we're pretty far removed from it,
There was one outlier this week, and that was Hungary. Among all we saw great shows of unity among NATO members. Now, there was this Bucharest 9 meeting of East European NATO members. Hungary sent its president, Elena Voloshin, but we also have heard a lot of mixed messages. What is it? This Friday, the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, once again saying, well, maybe we should wait before letting Sweden and Finland into the club.
Yeah, we all know that Hungary is being worked by there is this game of influence and the soft power by Russian spheres in Hungary for years now. So this position is just not surprising, but I think it's a shame because when there is such a war and such an invasion, you would expect that despite all this influence that has happened for years, like it happened in France, for example, with the extremes, like the far right as well as the far left, even though they would more align on this kind of positions toward Moscow throughout the years, when this shock happened, this shock of 24 February, you would expect that European, as conservative as they can be, politicians would just have their eyes wide open on the reality of Putin's regime, especially again when his speeches are being more and more radicalist, more and more extremist. And it's I don't know. I'm not a specialist on Hungarian politics, but I said yes. It's in the line.
But you put your finger on it. That's the big story. Just how deep in the weeds is Orban with Putin? That story hasn't been written yet.
Passing from Paris and Rome via Germany and Budapest, yes, China's top diplomat, he concluded a European tour in Moscow, where he paid lip service to a visit by his country's president in the coming months. That hasn't materialized yet. The battle for hearts and minds then played out at the United Nations General Assembly Thursday, where in a symbolic vote, 141 nations called for Russia to pull out of Ukraine. Only 7 sided with Moscow and voted against. But as we speak, Russia is still welcome in many ports, sometimes literally. Off Durban, South Africa, where joint naval drills are taking place, three-way naval drills with the Chinese. Alexander Kerry, we have a lot of viewers watching us from Africa, from other parts of the world, from Asia. Not everybody is all in or convinced that this is their fight.
Well, it is a complex and multi-layered issue here. I think we shouldn't underestimate the remnants and, well, I mean, let's put it that way, the hate that certain countries that have been colonized by France, by Germany, etc., still have against their former, these former empires. So it plays in the hand of Russia, of course. What also plays in the hand of Russia is this sort of nostalgic, very strange, but still nostalgic USSR kind of third, giving a voice to the global South, which was also sort of a myth that the USSR put in place at the time. And there is also somehow the tone deaf, let's say, attitude that certain countries, such as a big power in the West, tend to have towards the global South. I'm not saying it's important. I think it's more to listen to all the voices and to understand where it comes from. Ukraine recently announced it would try to shift its strategy towards Africa, especially, and to try and establish this dialogue. But it has been a missed dialogue from Western Europe when it comes to the global South and also Asia. That's very true.
Mariana, we saw at that press conference, Volodymyr Zelensky was asked about those 7 countries that sided with Moscow at the UN General Assembly, and his answer was they should try to understand what it's like to be in a war zone. He didn't lash out at them. Ukraine has dispatched its foreign minister to the African continent, is also trying to win this battle for hearts and minds.
Well, by the way, I would just like to remind that there is the United Nations. Of course, there is the Global West, as we would call it, but there is also a group. We can call it now like a sort of an alliance, which is called like the Ramstein Group, which are like several dozens of countries that meet regularly to bring primarily military aid to Ukraine, and in this in the list of these countries, there are countries from all the continents. There are Asian countries, there are African countries. By the way, speaking of African countries, there is a fun fact: Morocco gave or promised tanks to Ukraine. So the fun fact is that so far Morocco provided more tanks than the West. That is to say, so of course there is this space and room to work with, and this work should be done. Now we have to understand that Ukraine doesn't have or didn't have, like before, as much resources as needed to work its diplomacy and soft power all over the world, like Russia had. And unfortunately, the European countries, the Western countries, according to their political contexts, have been withdrawing gradually from this continent over the past decades, which left this space and room for Russia to operate. But given this, and given how intense are Russian efforts all over the world, we can even say that having only that 7 countries, and some of them are not even like countries, or some of them are occupied, let's be clear about it, it's a very poor result for a country like Russia.
Very poor results. So now, what next? Moments of joy can sometimes prove short-lived in Ukraine. Take the southern city of Kherson, retaken by the Ukrainian military on November the 11th. These were the images at the time. Since then, it's been bombed incessantly. This week, France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent spoke to residents who, despite it all, refused to leave. Here you see Olga walking her dogs.
We're staying. It is very frightening. The bombs fly around chaotically. I don't even know where we're coming from. The people who are left here are the most resistant. Firstly, we're worried about what could happen to our homes, and people are patriotic. They don't want to.
Elena Voloshin, in your reporting in the past year, going to those places where there are people who stay put, who won't leave, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm just back from Kherson, by the way. So yeah, it's always surprising when you see people that stay. But maybe it's not. I went to Chernobyl, you know, and you have people that went back to Chernobyl 3 months after the nuclear catastrophe. So and they lived there for the rest of their life, which was obviously shorter than it could have been. But it's just like this.
Very striking.
Just let's put ourselves on the place of these people. It's their home, maybe the home of their grandparents, their great grandparents. They've lived there forever. So I mean, it's not easy to leave it their home. And when we talk about war crimes and atrocities and so on, let's not forget that the bigger drama for populations is in war is just of leaving their homes, living their lives, and being displaced. This is a really huge drama, and not every person is strong enough and ready for it. And this is Kherson, but you have Bakhmut, which is like here you have half of chance of dying today when you wake up in the morning, if you wake up. So, and people are still there, and it's not always because they are disabled or you have also this case, but you just have like people who are just attached to their homes.
I can witness it. Just one moment to illustrate what Elena has just said. You know, I have left Kiev for Paris 15 years ago, so I'm not displaced from Kiev, if you want. I made my parents leave Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, 10 days prior to the full-scale invasion. But I can tell you how difficult it was to convince my parents, first of all, and they really trust me a lot, but even I myself, living in Paris, and just thinking that everything which is left at home, because when you leave just, you know, with some clothes and some, like, very necessary stuff. You leave everything. You leave your memories, you leave your soul, and you leave your even plants or whatever. And how difficult it is to think that, even to realize that probably, maybe, I will never come back to my home again. I will never be able to cross it. And so, yes, this should be understood. It's extremely difficult to live.
Something that a lot of people around the globe have experienced, but something we didn't expect. A reality we didn't expect here in Europe in the 21st century. Mariana Perebendiuk, thank you for being with us. I want to thank as well Craig Kapitas, Elena Voloshin. I want to thank as well Alexander Kerry for being with us from Kyiv. And thank you for joining us here. More coverage of this anniversary on France24.com.